It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to talk about this exhibition and the ideas that and the reflections that were instrumental in its planning and also in the research, because this started out as a research I did for a thesis, but that actually then it was just on Brazil, but I expanded it to Latin America in general. The exhibition was called Memories of Underdevelopment, Early Instances of Decolonial Aesthetics in Latin America, 1960 to 1985. So, as I mentioned before, this research started way before I even had the possibility of doing the exhibition. And it also started as a reflection on what was happening in my native country, Venezuela. And as the government there in the early 2000s, well, late 90s, with Chavez, started this turn towards, in culture at least, towards the popular, but really doing it in a very, how would I say, perhaps not the best way possible. And I'm really like shutting down institutions or just draining them out of money, etc. And then when I had the opportunity to go to Brazil in the mid 2000s, and I visited several places such as the Sesc Pompeia, etc., I had this chance to see these ideas actually at work. So this was maybe what prompted me, one of the things that prompted me to do this research, but also to understand how this idea of development had also been contested by several artists, thinkers, etc. So it sent me down that path. And then, which was more of a research in terms of culture and how would I say, culture, and not really so in the scope of art. But then I was also seeing the revisions that groups like Conceptualismos del Sur had been undertaking in the 2000s and in this decade as well. And I thought that their revisions and their pigeonholing these manifestations and this artistic production just to the sphere of conceptualism was highly reductive. So I was interested really in thinking how they were responsive to their environment, to what was happening, to the context, and to this very idea of development. And of course, the research did yield a lot in terms of this. When I interviewed the artists, the ones that were still alive or are still alive, and coming across the material, this idea of development was very present. So without further ado, I think I'm going to guide you through the show, because I think in that way we can discuss the ideas and certain details about that, and also because I have a lot of slides. So let's see if we can do them all. So I'm going to start with this quote by Mario Pedrosa. Ultramodernisms and their progress, usually shaped by the American template, are fundamentally tied to our favelas and shanty towns. The paradox is that these do not change, as neither do misery, hunger, poverty, huts, and ruins. But that is where the future passes by. Here is the option of the third world, an open future or eternal misery. The creative task of humanity begins to move to other latitudes and advances to the widest and most dispersed areas of the third world. The third world must build its own path to development. One that is decidedly different from the one taken by the world of the rich from the northern hemisphere. The cultural history of the third world will no longer be a repetition, en raccourci, of the recent history of the United States, West Germany, France, etc. It must cast from its heart the developmentalist mentality that is the bar that supports the colonialist spirit. So this last sentence really was illuminating for me, in the sense that here is the connection that can link the resistance to developmentalism in the 1960s and 70s to what was later developed as the coloniality, decoloniality, and modernity theories by Aníbal Quijano, Walter Mignolo, etc., which were actually articulated from the 90s onwards. So it was very interesting to see that the artists in this resistance to the developmentalist ethos had already prefigured what would then be, how would I say, put together as a cultural theory in the 1990s. And that, of course, is at the base of a lot of the decolonial thinking today. And of course, even before post-colonial a lot of post-colonial theory that was produced in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. So this research took me really in this direction to find those areas where these artists again were thinking about this precise situation and addressing it with a clarity that was very interesting in that sense. So we can do this a little more clearly because of course the PowerPoint is linear and the exhibition was not. And actually this organization of the show also mirrors the one in San Diego. This exhibition was done as part of for the first time, as part of the Getty Pacific Standard Time and initiative in 2017. So we did it at the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, and then it traveled to the Homex Foundation in Mexico City. So this is the floor plan at the Homex Foundation. I have the other ones from San Diego in a hard disk, but I don't have access to that now. And what we can see here, we have areas of blue and red. And I want you to pay attention to that because those are like the bifurcating ideas that inform the show. The show actually consisted of 8 sections. So here we have this one in gray, which deals with, this would be the introduction, and it was the double mirage of progress and development. And then if you went on this side, you would take, so to speak, the ideological turn, which had 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 sections. And if not, if you went on this side, you would take the affective turn, so to speak, that dealt with body and place and the sensorium. And actually, if the ideological turn is more of an act of resistance and denunciation, the other turn is one that proposes solutions or proposes alternatives. So, and Oiticica's work, which is here, stands in both of these sections and leads on to the rest of these of the works that pertain to this turner. So to this turn. So here we start with this Mirage of Development, and this is a mural by Atos Vulcão, who did lots of murals in Brasilia. And Brasilia is emblematic of this developmentalist ethos and how really you can, the physical manifestation of this was actually the rapid process of industrialization, but also the spread of this modern architecture in Latin America. And Brasilia is very emblematic of this. Brazil decides to build a new capital where there was nothing. And Juscelino Kubitschek would say he was promising 5 years of development in 50 years of development in 5, which is the period in which he built Brasilia. But of course, the country was after that mired in debt and inflation. And so Kubitschek was succeeded by Jânio Quadros, whose presidency lasted only a few months, and then by João Goulart, who really although also being a developmentalist, he came with a series of reforms to address the shortcomings of the application of these developmentalist measures in the economy, etc. And these measures were met with a lot of resistance by the country's elites. So a little bit, the Brazilian part of this story happens during the government of João Goulart, and then we'll see a little bit of that later on. So here, this section of the show had images from basically, well, Chile, of course, where the headquarters of the CEPAL are. The CEPAL is the Comisión Económica para América Latina. And this is where the organization from which these policies were conceived and instrumentalized in Latin America. So it was sort of think tank to usher Latin America towards modernity and towards progress, etc. However, even from the ranks of the political scientists and economists and sociologists at the CEPAL came a lot of dissidents, which then was, how would I say, grouped into what we call today the theory of underdevelopment or theory of dependency theory. So people like Celso Furtado or Gunder Frank was never affiliated to the CEPAL, but actually he wrote a very important book in terms of dependency theory. And these theorists started realizing that development was nothing other than a renovation of this colonial project and a renovation of the relations of dependency that bound Latin America to the former colonial metropolises. So it was another type of relation between the former colonies and the metropolises in Europe, or then even the United States as an industrial power in the 20th century, and that all of these policies, such as that try to usher Latin America into this stage of development, with this heavy industrialization, granting of concessions for the exploitation of natural resources to transnational companies, etc., would really just place Latin America as a dependent continent that would export cheap raw materials and actually also provide cheap labor, and then have to buy these product backs at imported prices from the centers. So basically this is in a nutshell what dependency theory was critiquing. And in the realm of culture, artists saw the same thing happening as well, with the encroachment of Western ideas of art and culture sort of dominating the scene, even modernism as something that was imported. So we have moments of resistance even from the 1920s, for example, with the Semana de Arte Moderna in São Paulo, and then in 1928 with the publication of the Manifesto Antropófago. You have in Peru Mariátegui's Amauta, and so there are these moments of resistance, of also giving value to the indigenous cultures that were being erased or had been tried to being erased by centuries of colonial domination. But again, now they were being erased by this penetration of Western culture. These are some materials that I had for my research. They were not in the show, but these are Time magazines from the 1950s. So the Time covers, one features Brazil and President Kubitschek. And as you see, this kind of mixture between the tropics and the booming metropolis, in this case, São Paulo, not Brasilia. And then you have the Venezuelan military dictator, Marcos Pérez Jiménez, with, again, the nature, the lush nature of the tropics, but also the resources like oil and the modern architecture again. So, and here we have the CEPAL, Santiago de Chile, and so this idea of order and progress. So this is Juscelino Kubitschek offering 50 years of progress in 5 years. This was the motto that animated the construction of Brasilia, but also that distinguished his period as a president of Brazil. So here he is in the inauguration of Brasilia. Here with, so this is the Avenida Monumental. So as you see, it's a city that was basically, it was built from where there was nothing. Here we can see in these aerial photographs by Marcel Gautreau. So also, as now speaking as a curator, not a researcher, for me, it was important also to choose images that were made by photographers who are not just documenting. I mean, the photographs by Marcel Gautreau capture this sort of haunting and phantasmagoric character of Brasilia, of an incomplete Brasilia. And that was important also to show how this idea of the modernity being built ends up being an idea, an image as well of an incomplete modernity and an unfinished one. So of course, the world took note. And for example, there was the show at the Museum of Modern Art, Brazil Builds, that actually went from the Baroque to the modern. Then we had this sort of moment as well where Brazilian culture and design was very much circulating around the world, especially in the school at Ulm. So this is a poster by Mari Vieira for an exhibition on Brazilian architecture. Here we have the Edificio Capanema, which housed the Ministry of Education in Rio. So the building was designed by Costa, Niemeyer, and Reidy, Burle Marx, and Le Corbusier as a consulting architect. And this is Burle Marx's plan for the garden that we see here. Here's another shot of the Capanema building, which actually Bolsonaro, until 2 weeks ago, was trying to sell to the highest bidder, but I think he was stopped. So then we have another view of the Capanema, Afonso Reidy's building for the Museo de Arte Moderna de Rio de Janeiro, and Afonso Reidy as well with the Pedregulho housing complex in Rio de Janeiro. So we can see also that many public infrastructure, such as hospitals, schools, university cities, social housing, and government buildings were part of this idea of building this progress and modernity. So if a country was to be modern, it also had to build this infrastructure. So architecture really played a large role in this. And of course, the language, the architectural language, was that of the international style. So while Brazilians and Mexican architects and Venezuelan architects and Argentinian architects made it into their own and actually transformed it, the precepts were the same. And Le Corbusier's ideas of thinking about space rather than place were very much informing this. So the idea was to erase favelas and townships and build in their stead these buildings that would create a better way of life for its inhabitants, and something that did actually not work out that way as well. So if you go to Pedregulho today, it's mired in crime, and people have really change the apartments, etc. So we see here Mexico builds, so this amazing painting that I couldn't get for the show by Juan O'Gorman. So it shows the city in 1947, and it shows the Uppsala map, which is one of the earliest maps of Tenochtitlan. And we have the worker, the mason, with the blueprint for this new modern city, which is populated by factories and office buildings, etc. So one of the important enterprises was UNAM, which is the university city. And here we have some of this architecture. And of course, another housing complex, which is the Complejo Habitacional Tlatelolco Nonoalco, which, as many of you may know, was the site of the Tlatelolco massacre in 1968. And then in 85, during the earthquake, a few of its buildings collapsed. So it's a very contested site, not only because of that, but because the Plaza de las Tres Culturas actually holds a very interesting metaphor there, because it's the Tres Culturas, the original culture of the Aztecs that was colonized. So you have the church built by the Spanish conquistadors, and then you have the modernist buildings built in the 1940s late 40s by Mario Pani. So I think that Plaza de las Tres Culturas offers you that layering that you can see, where you can see actually that the developmentalism is actually a sort of re-edition of that colonial moment. So here you see another view, and then you have the Plaza de las, you have the other square, but this is next to the Plaza de las Tres Culturas. And then you have Matias Geritz and Barragán and Chucho Reyes, the Torres de Satélite. And then in Venezuela, you have an oil field modernity. So the highways, again, the repetition of this style, also the idea of integration of the arts, which also was very important in the university city of UNAM. And here in the Aula Magna in Caracas, where there were collaborations by many artists, national and international. And again, these images of an unbuilt modernity that are very telling and speak of this incomplete project. So the coexisting realities, development and underdevelopment. So even from the very foundation of Brasilia, which was built by these guest workers who then had nowhere else to go and started the first shanty town in Brasilia. So you have the mechanics of exclusion already at work. You have the contradictions of this rapid modernization and development. And you have these gleaming new buildings while social, the needs of society and the needs of human beings are not really being addressed. No? So Peter Shaya has a series of photographs that were really telling of these contradictions and how they were present from the very moment and are actually, how would I say, essential to thinking of that so-called failure of modernity in Latin America. Here another photograph by Thomas Farkas on the inauguration day. So again, you see the divorce between this architecture and people who basically, a lot of them were illiterate. So the problem of illiteracy was another important one that I address actually in the show. So you have these, again, coexisting realities. This is Núcleo Bandeirante, a few kilometers away from this. So here you have no sewage, no roads, nothing, just shacks that house the builders of, and who themselves make a little city. As you see again, there's, you have the watchmaker, and then you have the restaurant, and then you have, so you see these people are making a place for themselves, even though this is just a sort of temporary shanty town for the workers while they built this city. So again, we come back to the floor plan. I will repeat it a lot of times because it's good to place you in terms of how these nuclei of the exhibition connect to each other. So the ideological turn. I will go first with this one. And I want to go back to the roots of the show and to this moment of modern architecture, but in art that was not featured in the show, because actually the only art that I wanted to show was the art that actually brought about this shift, this paradigm shift, and that broke away from the canon of the modern in such different and interesting ways. So, and ways that really you cannot pigeonhole just into the conceptual. So the ideological turn dealt with that, but on the other hand, why I want to go back a little bit to the 1950s and to the fact that many of the artists, especially in Brazil, who affected this turn in the 1950s had started to make art and experimenting with form, color, and abstraction, and really learning the lesson from the Russian constructivists. And for example, someone like Elio Itisica constantly speaks of Malevich. And for me, it was also interesting to connect this to something that happens in Russia in the 1920s, specifically in this moment of Russian constructivism, but also productivism. And it is what Benjamin Buchloh has described as factura and factography. So artists who were working more along the lines of, how would I say, the material, the color, and shape and form itself, and the non-objective form would be the artists working within this idea of factura, whereas the ones working with factography were experimenting with the more recent mediums of cinema and photography. And with photography, they were making collage, like Rodchenko, or a photo montage, and also in film you have Eisenstein also experimenting with techniques of montage. So it's interesting to see how these two conditions for art production also inform or are at the base of this rupture. So I would say that the factographic turn, which is how to use photography, text, and to ideological ends up informing the artists who are working within this ideological turn. So this was actually the first work you encountered when you entered the exhibition. And it was Glauber Rocha's Estética da Fome. So that's one of his manifestos, his many manifestos, but the two most well-known ones are Estética da Fome and Estética do Sonho. Então, sorry, I was going to speak Portuguese. I've spent 2 months in Brazil lately. So Glauber Rocha says, Latin America remains a colony. What distinguishes yesterday's colonialism from that of today is merely the more refined form of the colonizer. Meanwhile, those who are preparing for future domination try to replace this with a more subtle form. Internationally, the problem facing Latin America is still that of merely exchanging colonizers. Therefore, any possible liberation will probably come in the form of a new dependency. This economic and political conditioning has led us to philosophical undernourishment and to impotence, which produces sterility when conscious and hysteria when unconscious. So a very interesting, so Glauber Rocha in this manifesto really is voicing the same concerns that Mario Pedrosa was in the first text that we encountered when I started this slideshow. And he, again, seeing this idea of development as substituting, as a kind of new form of colonization. And so attacking dependency was at the forefront of his agenda as a filmmaker, not only his ideological agenda, but also his aesthetic agenda. And the response that he came up with was violence, a violence that in the filmic language was really signified by sort of delirium. So maybe I'm going to share a little bit of Terra en Trance, because this was the film that you encountered upon entering this section of the exhibition as well. And that for me is essential to understand not only what comes next in the exhibition, but also how Rocha really dissects the elements of this renovation of the colonial project. So he has three, in this scene that I will play for you, but I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. He has three elements or three characters. He has the politician that represents the corruption, but also that is the result of this colonialist regime of what Roberto Schwartz called the culture of favor. And then he has the bureaucrat, he has the priest representing the church, and the church, of course, as a principal agent of the colonization in the Americas, as you all know. And then he has the oppressed.
O nosso presidente quer ser o novo Napoleão e Dias, o novo César. Somente você tem condições para ser o novo Lincoln. Pedro negou Cristo 3 vezes, mas foi Pedro que fundou a Igreja de Deus. E Judas, o traidor, enforcou-se no... Senhores, abramos trilhas nas florestas. Podemos 1000 cidades onde antes eram países selvagens e pontes sobre rios, estradas cortando o deserto, máquinas arrancando minério da terra. Se não fossem os padres, o que seria das Américas? O que seria dos astecas, dos incas e dos maias? O que seria dos tupis, dos tamoios, dos aimorés e dos chavantes? O que seria da fé?
And then you have the priest that says, what would be of all these Indian peoples of the Americas if it were not for religion. So in a sense, the very perverse mechanism of the encomienda, which is actually the first form of labor, of slave labor in the New World, exchanged labor and for free labor for spiritual salvation or for conversion to the faith of Catholicism. And you can see that in the 20th century, the salvation just came in form of progress and development. So instead of so cheap labor instead of free labor, but almost to the point of being slave labor with the minimum wage in the Americas, in exchange for this utopia of progress and development, which was really a mirage. So, and then of course you have the third element, and we didn't get to seeing that scene, which is the oppressed. And then, for example, Glaube Rocha, it's a very interesting because of course everyone realizes that this takes place maybe in Brazil, but it also may take place anywhere in Latin America. They're actually in a country called El Dorado. So El Dorado really stands for underdeveloped and dependent Latin America. And it's a metaphor for this. And then here on the other side, after this, another film that was playing was Lígia Pape's Catiti Catiti, which is again another very interesting film, but where she learns the lesson of Glaube Rocha, with whom she collaborated a lot. She made the credits for many of his films, and she's really part of thinking about this revolution of that Cinema Novo represented in Brazil at that time. And this film is a sort of delirium, but also where she plays out a version of, how would I say, the foundational myth of the Republic, which is the conquest, because also very contradictorily, so when the independence of many of the Latin American nations occurs in the 19th century, the art made in the late 19th century to commemorate this moment really is very much imported from France. It's really Pompier painting, and Pompier painting that depicts the moment of colonization, such as in Brazil, we have this famous painting of the planting of the cross. So you have the Indians surrendering to the cross and the conquerors. You have another one of Pedro de Valdivia conquering the Mapuche in Chile. And then you have different paintings that depict this moment of contact between the old and the new world. But of course, of conquest and colonization, and usually they're protagonized by a cross. And these become the foundational images for these newly independent republics. So as you see, they're built on the colonialist past. And this is something that artists are very aware of and are trying to also dismantle with using these symbols and this imagery. So here she takes the voiceover of this film is a letter of Pero Vaz de Caminha to the King of Portugal, describing his encounter with the Tupinamba. But again, she makes this whole play on anthropophagy as well as a cultural strategy, as an artistic strategy, and mixes it with clips of René Claes' Entr'acte, and where Duchamp appears playing chess. So she has this man who is just mostly seen eating and devouring this fruit and other foods, also devouring the Bishop Sardinha, who is actually Marcel Duchamp in the film with this strategy of photomontage. And so this was the entrance. In the show, these two films framed this section, which dealt with how artists were perceiving this encroachment of transnational corporations extracting resources from the land, displacing indigenous peoples from their territories, eroding the land through monocultures, etc. So we have here works by Juan Downey, for example, Make Chile Rich, which speaks of the, oh, sorry, I didn't put the full screen, of the fertilizer. So the Chilean nitrate of potash, which is a naturally occurring fertilizer in Chile, but then Chile was importing fertilizer, artificial fertilizer produced by companies like Monsanto. So again, that's the whole dynamics of dependency. While a country is rich in something, it really exports the raw material for it to be processed and be sold back to them as some artificial thing. And this piece here, which is the Anaconda Map of Chile, is a piece that he made for an exhibition that was what is now known as the America Society. And the America Society was the Center for Inter-American Relations in New York, a Rockefeller funded institution. It still is. And he presented this work, which again, if you see the map on the corner, this is the map that you see in many government institutions, schools, etc., map of Chile. And on the corner, you have this painting of a foundational moment of the Chilean Republic, which is the conquest. So this is the painting that shows Pedro de Valdivia. So Downey really, he had this snake in living there on top of the map, but really what his critique was of the Anaconda mining company, which was controlling the copper mines of Chile and was instrumental, or so it is said, in financing the coup against Allende. So when invited to show a work at a show at America Society or Center for Inter-American Relations at the time, he does this work and it was censored. The Anaconda had to be removed, but essentially it was a censorship of the work. I always show this with material I found in his archive where he had a correspondence, or he writes in his diaries as well, about an incident with the curator, Nita Renfrew, who came to his house and told him she was being hunted down by the CIA because of this work. So, there was a lot of paranoia going around at that time regarding the presentation of this work, and actually pinpointing the extractivist activities of the Rockefellers in Chile at the time. So we have here Antonio Caro's El imperialismo es un tigre de papel, which Antonio did for the show again, because the work had been lost at the time. So here we had it. And so this phrase by Mao, again, also artists, there were a lot of ideological struggles at the time, and also the artists sided with the left, of course. But basically it is a moment when it's not really about left or right, but rather about South. And this is an aligning with other countries around the world who came to form the third world, so to speak, another axis that was made, how would I say, conformed by ex-colonies or countries that were just beginning to gain their independence. And so it all harks back also to the Bandung Conference of 1955 for the non-aligned countries, and how Latin America also comes to form part of this global South, but called third world at that time. And that is why Mario Pedrosa said this third world has to build its own future, aside from dependency, and has to break free from the shackles of this path towards a false progress. So many of the artists were working with maps. So the amount of artists working with maps is very interesting here, because it's really about the territory seeing as a territory full of resources, a territory that is just there to be mined and eroded until it's no longer productive. It's not seen as a place. It's seen from the aerial view. This is the aerial view of modernism, so of modernity. So we had maps by Annabella Geiger, by Horacio Zavala, Claudio Perna, by Elda Serrato. And Elda Serrato is very interesting here. She begins to include the crowd, the masses, or rather the multitude. So she says, well, this territory is populated by peoples, you know, by un pueblo. And so this idea becomes very important in her cartographies, which she would call geohistories. So here we have works, again, that also critiqued the church, exactly in that same role, that casted exactly in that same role as Glauber Rocha's film. So here we have Catalina Parra's Let the Pope Pay the External Debt. And what she's actually alluding to here is that if Latin America is in this situation, it is precisely because it began on the wrong foot by exchanging labor for religious salvation, a spiritual salvation. And this is a work that in the end was not in the show, but I had considered it. And we had this Cecilia Vicuña Sueño, which of course, it paints a very vivid picture of the indigenous cultures really aiming at the church or at the Pope. So we can see this is a very, very strong line of thinking among the artists in this period as well. So here again, we have another view where we see Katiti and many of these map works, and also Juan Downey's video, which I recommend. I'm going to put that in a link when we have the section for the questions, called Chicago Boys. It's a work that he made in the early 80s, 1983, I think, where he interviews the economists who were the ideators of the Chilean miracle with Pinochet, a Chilean miracle that was actually very short-lived. And this is the moment when it's beginning to crumble and the Chilean economy is beginning to collapse. And these economists were trained at the University of Chicago, hence the name Chicago Boys, and were basically applying Milton Friedman's theories to the Chilean economy. And so for me also, the cinematic component, the cinematographic and video component of the show was very important because it also lent a narrative, and also in different aspects, from Lija Pape making this play with Duchamp and the Obispo Sardinia, and this European modernism being swallowed and regurgitated as something totally Brazilian, or Glauber Rocha with his aesthetics of hunger, and then you have Juan Downey actually with this film, with this video that really makes a very clear case for how the Chilean economy was destroyed, how the monoculture, how the extractive how would I say, dynamics of these transnational corporations really impoverished the Chilean people, left them without access to their resources, and made them dependent. And then we have Annabella Geiger's maps. And also close to Downey, in another point of that section, we had, well, here are Elda Serrato's maps, and as you see, the maps become peopled, and then they begin to become landscapes again. So this is La Hora de los Pueblos, and this was placed very close to La Hora de los Hornos, the film by Octavio Getino and Fernando Solanas of 1968, which again states that Latin America, and in this case Argentina, is going through a second or a renovation of the colonialist project. And so it's very interesting to see that these artists, filmmakers, are all aligned against this idea of development and really see it as this renovation of the colonial project. And speaking in art historical terms, that's why I questioned a lot this pigeonholing of these practices, not all of them, but of course the artistic ones, by conceptualismos del sur as just being conceptual. First of all, that reduced them to being derivative of conceptualist practices from the United States or Europe, but to really showcase them here as very explicitly being drafted in response to this situation, really and using a language that came from film and photography, also cast them within that factographic turn that really informed these artists thinking about ways of resistance through propaganda, but also through this idea of the photograph and the fact. So we have here the still from La Hora de los Hornos, and when not a still from the film, but the presentation of the film, and Tucumán Arde, which happened along the same period of time. And again, Tucumán had been the poster child for developmentalist policies in Argentina, especially with agriculture. So they had turned the whole town into, or that whole area into, had devoted it to the cultivation of sugarcane. So the monoculture had then, with the turn in the economy, really thrust all of these people into misery. And so from being the poster child for these developmentalist policies, it really became the poster child for the poverty and the misery of an underdeveloped nation. So artists took notice and did this artistic intervention there, and which came to be known as Tucumán Arde. And here we see Visite Tucumán, Jardín de la Miseria, etc. So now we see the unrest unfolding in throughout Latin America in the late 60s. So we have here Tlatelolco, which we saw in the section of the Mirage of Modernity, and now with manifestations just before the Olympic Games. And this is where the massacre occurred in 1968. And then we have works by Antonio Manuel, like the Flans, Bala Mata Fome, which is, and then it says, Pão Nosso de Cada Dia, our daily bread is violence. So we have violence, hunger, oppression, and again, so that is what this utopia of development and progress really brought about. And again, we see this is a work by Luis Passos that says dependencia en liberación, no? So the thought, these artists were clearly thinking in this direction, and this is Taller Cuatro Rojo, again, a work that clearly signals to the displacement of indigenous and peasant populations from their lands. We see this here, the shackles around the feet of this person on the ground, lying on the ground, presumably dead, have the logos of different transnational corporations. So this is a work from the 1974. Here is Juan Downey's Make Chile Rich, made for one of the CAIC shows for a profile of Latin American art. And then Information and Ideology, which was one of the sections that dealt with how the artists were using information and the circulation of information to convey their message. And the CAIC, Centro de Arte y Comunicación in Argentina, was instrumental in this endeavor. Sorry, I'm just gonna look at the time. And CAIC actually also, how would I say, conceived of a method to make these very low-cost transportable exhibitions with this sort of normalized blueprint format that the artists would intervene. So here we have a selection and a photograph of the Grupo de los 13, and here was a vitrine with different publications by the CAIC, from books to newsletters, the famous newsletters that they used to send out every week or so. And when I made a selection of books and newsletters that actually did very precisely address this condition of dependency and underdevelopment. As we can see, we had works like Teresa Burgas, which actually is a very pioneering work in the sense that she's relating also the problem of race to a biopolitical problem as well. So this profiling of the Peruvian woman is also underlies this idea that the indigenous peoples were profiled and the construction of race as a colonial construct. But it's interesting that she does this work more or less at the same time that Foucault is delivering his lectures on biopolitics at the Collège de France. And she's talking about this idea of biopolitics in a very, how would I say, explicit way with this precise work. And then we had Beyond Dependency, the Latin American Problem, Structural Poverty and Marginality. Again, this was a section that you could enter from the favela of Oitisicas Tropicalia, or from Teresa Burgas and Alfredo Yar's works. And again, this idea of delinquency, marginality, poverty. So also these mechanisms of marginalizing population and how artists really sought to address this. So here we have Eugenio Dittborn with the series on the women, female criminals, or we have Antonio Manuel. We have the filmmakers from Cali and what the genre that was called pornomiseria. And this is the famous film Agarrando Pueblo, which is a film that really showed this misery that politicians tried to hide at its raw condition, at its raw state. And we have Cada, and we have Tiamela Eltit, and Alfredo Portillos. And so we had El Beso here, and this is still from Agarrando Pueblo. So again, these were the narratives that also were silenced by officialist instances, and how artists also wanted to show that face, that, how would I say, the darker side of this, of this idea of progress and development, and how it left huge swaths of the population marginalized and outcast from whatever benefit it was set to do. Now we go to the other section where, here would be the bluer sections here on this side of the exhibition. And so really it's from the logic of space to the logic of place. And it really is about a turn that relies on the body, on the senses, on thinking about place rather than space. So here we have again Brasilia, and this sketch is very telling. You have a cross laid out in the land. This is again the metaphor of the church, even though unwittingly. And then that cross becomes some sort of bird, and then an airplane and the city. And you don't build a city just because it's going to look like an airplane or a bird and it's very beautiful. But then again, it's not really there was nothing there, basically. In a sense, it's better than Le Corbusier's plan for Algiers, which basically intended to raise down a centuries or thousands of years old city and replace it with these modernist towers. And here, this turn really was about not doing this, but actually counteracting that and thinking about place and thinking about the body. So here we started with a film, actually a clip from Ligia Pape's staging of the oval, the egg, and where the samba dancers and actually Elio Oiticica in the photograph emerge out from these cubes of pure white, pure blue, and pure red, and suddenly it's like popular culture emerging from the canon of constructivism. So rather than turning away from that canon, and I think this piece beautifully states this, they resignified this constructive tradition that was so dear to them, and they resignified it upon the parameters of the body and of the senses and of place. So basically, it's not a rupture with the constructive tradition. It is a continuation, but through their own terms. And these terms have to pass through the body, through the sensorium, and to think about also place. And then, so that's why you can say it's an effective turn in that sense. And so here we also had works by Eugenia Espinoza. This is a very interesting one because then again, a grid, which is again a very abstract constructivist shape or related to that and to the Cartesian rationality, but it's weighted down by coconuts. So it's basically sort of becomes a hammock for these coconuts, but it's a metaphor for the weighing down of this Cartesian tradition by the weight of the tropics. And so I think these works that were made at around the same time period at least, are pointing in the same direction or in a similar direction. So breaking for the modernist mold, embodying revolt and a reformulation of the constructed paradigm from the coordinates of body and place. So here we see Oiticica with the parangolé. So basically it's the wearable abstract form, but then again now also taking into account these materials that belong to like burlap sacks in the market or coarse fabrics that were used for different things, and they had also these little plastics with different materials, etc. So this idea of being able to feel this place or a situation or was very important to them. This is a photograph of here you see Nildo da Mangueira and Elio Oiticica emerging from these cubes. So here in the favela of Mangueira, the sambistas wearing the parangolés. And this is, of course, the Tropicalia installation, which Oiticica did for a show that he curated called New Brazilian Objectivity in 1967. And so this is the presentation here of the piece. And again, this is Oiticica taking his earlier penetrables of the early 60s to another dimension, whereas the other penetrables or spatial propositions were really spatial. They were just planes of color hanging by threads from the ceiling, and forms and color, whereas now this was a place filled with sounds, textures, smells, and the polemical parrots that a lot of people protested about, but that were actually did give a lot to the sense of this being a different place and this space of the favela. So we have the Pureza un Mito and Imagética, and then we had a section that we saw here that before in terms of communication, but these three works were actually in New Brazilian Objectivity. So Caixa das Baratas by Lígia Pape, this work by Antonio Dias, who very sadly died while the show was on and in Mexico, and Ruben Gershman's Lindoneia, which was a woman who was the subject of this sort of very popular tale, and she was this working class figure, and who actually also was the first, was featured on the first cover of one of the Tropicalia albums. So then we have radical pedagogy. So springing from this turn, we see again a turn in education and how artists are recognizing that education is basically a structure of domination, a power structure, and how pedagogy, these radical pedagogies can change that equation and form the minds of citizens who question and problematize the world they live in, and who understand the situations that they're in it and have an awareness that will enable them to overcome these difficulties and not remain trapped by the how would I say, the structures of oppression that have been designed around them. So these are the dia films made by Paulo Freire for his program of alphabetization, here with drawings by Francisco Brenand, an artist from Recife, who made these drawings. And for Freire and his pedagogy, it was of tantamount importance to have the person, illiterate person, learn to read by presenting them with situations that were familiar to them. It was of no use to present them with an abstract situation that dealt with the city when they were living off the land, or were in a rural situation as well, or were indigenous peoples. And so this was also the basis for this concientización, as he called it. So this section dealt with that, and it had works by different artists, and not only the section devoted to Paulo Freire, but also this piece by Lígia Pape, which is the Book of Creation, which is a book that also, it's a non-object, but it could also be read by someone who doesn't read. So there was this idea that it was very important to have the apprentice of the language of the written language understand language as something that he could shape in the same way that they could shape their reality. So these were different pedagogic experiments of the period. So here we have the autogestión in the schools of architecture in Puebla, but also in Mexico City. And we have the Escuela de Valparaíso. So those are the torneos de Manuel Casanueva. This is a critique of the traditional methods of education by Peruvian artists. And then here is this little section on Paulo Freire's pedagogical experiments in the 1960s. And then we have popular invention, how the artists incorporated the vocabulary of the popular into their own practices, unlearning the West and learning from these popular languages, from Lina Bobardi in architecture to Lígia Pape as well, and Glaube Rocha, Elio Itisica. So we can see this influence, but also I wanted to include an artist who is now featured in the Bienal de São Paulo, Juraci Doria, who worked in isolation for many years in the region of Bahia and Feira de Santana, but working with the materials of his place, like the leather that is so prevalent in this region of cowboys and of cattle. So here we have stills from Deus e o Diabo na Terra do Sol. The film was also playing on a loop in that room, and Lina Bobardi on her chair. And the exhibition ended basically on a note. So this is a continuation of this section, but in Peru, and how also the artists were engaging with popular vocabularies, but in a very critical way, not in such a romantic way, perhaps, as the Brazilians. And so we have here the Luis Arias Vera Carrera de Chasquis for the Contacta Festival. This is also for the Contacta Festival, Fernando Coco Bedoya, the Becerro de Oro. And Magnetized Spaces, this is sort of the opening, open ending of the show. So the people, the masses, and the multitude. So whilst for 500 years, the people had been turned into a malleable mass, these artists sought to regain that aspect of the multitude. So these were works that ended on a more positive note, so to speak, and on this transformation. So we have works by Lígia Pape, such as her Magnetized Spaces and her Divisor, which was not in the show, Carnival in Rio, again, as a form of the multitude expressing itself, but also reclaiming a cultural form that belonged to the slaves. And this is Lina Bobardi's architecture at MASPI São Paulo, and Leandro Katz's Multitud. And so this is the end of the show, of the exhibition. And thank you.